inclusion, it's a girl thing, and including girls with disabilities in our efforts to uplift and empower girls. And I chose this topic a few months in advance because I figured that something would happen in October that would make the need to support and uplift girls loom pretty large in our culture and our community. I was a little more right about that than I wanted to be, but I'm glad that we're talking about it, and I hope that this is helpful to everyone, because we're living in times where girls, there's things girls have always dealt with, but we're living in times where girls particularly need support, where Jewish girls need a Jewish response to what's going on, and where it's really important to include Jewish girls with disabilities in our response to the girl things that are happening these days. And that's really easy to inadvertently overlook. So we're going to talk some about why that's easy to inadvertently overlook and what to do about it. So a lot of this comes down to Jewish identity and Jewish community, because in Jewish educational settings, especially informal education in Hebrew school or in Hebrew high or in camp or a youth movement, a lot of what we're doing is focusing on Jewish identity building and positive relationship to Jewishness and Jewish community, part because it can be real hard to be a Jewish kid. The weight of anti-Semitism is a lot for our kids to carry, and they need our help. And Jewish education helps kids to sort of understand that aspect of the world, develop a positive Jewish identity, and not be squished by it. And so we need to include Jewish girls, as girls, Jewish girls as girls with disability, in this positive Jewish identity development. Make sure that when we say Jewish identity, we mean all of our kids, including the girls with disabilities. And I think we've seen it doesn't necessarily happen by itself. The status quo is really untenable for Jewish girls with disabilities on a number of levels, all the things they're carrying. Because as girls, they're carrying sexism. As Jews, they're carrying anti-Semitism. As people with disabilities, they're carrying ableism, bigotry, and discrimination against people with disabilities. They often face all three at the same time. And some of them are also people of color, some of them are gays, some of them are trans or otherwise facing multiple forms of discrimination. It's a lot. They need us to be on their side, and they need us to include them in what we mean when we say Jewish identity and Jewish community. Part of this, and I say this a lot about disability, is that we gotta be more Jewish about inclusion and about empowerment. And implicit bias can mean that we focus on boys, we focus on people without disabilities. And I think that we can really uplift everyone a lot more if we start with the presumption that the lives and experiences of all of us, including Jews with disabilities, including women with disabilities and Jewish girls with disabilities, our lives and experiences are morally and spiritually significant and require a Jewish response. The great thing about that is that we've got a lot to work with. We have a spiritual framework for facing injustice as Jews, for facing difficulty, for building positive identity and holiness and community in the face of some real hard things. We can apply that to girls, we can apply that to disability, and we can lift it up. We can lift people up by really realizing that Jewishness is applicable to all of us. The text and liturgy and spiritual frameworks change a lot when we value our whole voice. And so part of what girls are dealing with, and girls with disabilities in particular, is just a pretty difficult process of navigating, figuring out how to make life work is a girl and a woman, because there's no universal answers to this. There are no easy answers to this. It takes a lot of trial and error for girls and women to figure out what's going to be the most tenable for them. Usually involves some conformity, some non-conformity. Figuring it out involves a lot of conflict for some people, especially teenage girls, especially young teenage girls. And they need our support in navigating this, especially girls who are also dealing with the intersection of disability. We're Jewish with our whole selves, as girls, as women, as people with disabilities, as everything we are. So let's think about, what are Jewish girls with disabilities experiencing? How are their experiences part of the Jewish conversation? And what is our Jewish communal and spiritual response to this? How do we support them? So let's think about the context that girls operate in. What's hard about being a girl? How's it more complicated for girls with disabilities? How can we help? How can we frame it? So it starts from, it's a girl. And when we call a baby a girl, we're not just saying this is a girl with a particular type, this is a kid with a particular type of body. Our culture categorizes people as girls or women, or boys or girls, and it treats them very differently based on what category they're assigned to, in some ways that are related to bodies, in some ways that are not. Calling a baby a girl comes with a lot of expectations about how she'll see herself, how she'll act, and what her life will be like. And these expectations get complicated. Another complicating factor is that sometimes we guess wrong. When we put a baby into a gender category, we're making a guess about which category they'll see themselves in, which category they'll live within. Sometimes when we think a baby's a girl, that baby grows up to be a man or to be non-binary. Sometimes when we think a baby's a boy, the baby grows up to be a girl or non-binary. And so that's complicated. It's always a guess. We may not always know with certainty which kids are girls and which kids aren't. But we do know that girls exist and that girls need our support, and we need to think about the context girls operate in. And there's another sense in which we always guess wrong about gender and babies, because what we've meant by woman and man has been really problematic. Historically, part of what it's meant to be a man is to have power over women. Part of what it's meant to be a woman is to be expected to tolerate sexual violence from men. And I think we've seen some examples of that loom real large lately. And our gender norms and how girls are socialized have historically involved teaching girls to accept a lot of inequality, powerlessness, and violence. And that's not what any of us want for our girls. But fixing it's easier said than done. We're still kind of trying to figure out how to fix it. We make a lot of guesses about how to make this better, and sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. And there's a lot of trial and error, both for us and for the girls we're supporting. So the gender expectations that are put on girls have to do predominantly with seeing them as future adult women. It usually involves being expected to grow up and become a woman and to prepare for that. And for women in general, and Jewish women in particular, a lot of what's expected is growing up and becoming a wife and mother. And girls have a lot of girl-thing expectations that are bound up in preparing for that, which are, again, are different in different cultures and subcultures, but some that are common that I think we're familiar with are things like playing with dolls, learning to put on makeup, getting a good education, showing that girls can do anything, any number of different things, but it's bound up in this expectation that you're preparing to be an adult woman. And for Jewish girls, some things that often involves are things like having a bat mitzvah, identifying with Jewish girls and dating Jewish boys, growing up to become a Jewish wife and mother, in particular, planning to use your body to physically contribute to Jewish continuity by bearing children is an expectation that looms, I think, fairly large in most of our communities. And also the expectation that you get a good education and have a respectable career, sometimes with the competing expectation of, but make sure it doesn't interfere with having kids, right? I think these expectations are complicated and intersect with each other in somewhat strange ways, but they also loom very large. Another component of this that's really important in our efforts to support girls is that there's a lot more to being a woman than facing sexism. As large as sexism and misogyny and violence can loom in our lives, that's not the only thing that being a woman means. Most women and girls care about seeing themselves as women and girls in some sort of positive way. Most women and girls value at least some of the things about their bodies. Most women and girls value at least some things about their gender. And being able to see and engage with those positives matter too. And I want to be careful not to define womanhood solely in terms of violence, because I think that leads nowhere good and just makes people afraid and scared. So girls with disabilities, for girls with disabilities, the context, all of that context is there, but it plays out a bit differently. So let's think about how gender, sex, and sexism are different for girls with disabilities, how ableism is part of that, and what we can do to support Jewish girls with disabilities in navigating the things they have to navigate. One really big difference between girls with and without disabilities is that sexism is real different when you're not seen as a potential adult. And kids with disabilities are often not seen as potential adults, especially girls. Because since gender norms for girls are so closely bound up in the expectation that they're preparing to be wives and mothers, and girls with disabilities are often seen as people who shouldn't, and who are therefore seen as people who are not potential adults. And that means that they face sometimes the same gendered pressure to do gender stuff, but also are seen as outside the meaning of it sometimes. So that can get very complicated. And one way this can play out is that typically developing girls are usually expected to learn to be women. Sometimes that expectation is different for girls with disabilities. Sometimes what disabled girls are expected to do is to learn to act like typically developing girls, sort of act like imitation girls, which can be very humiliating and disorienting and hard to unpack. So some of the expected behavior may be the same, some of it may not be, but the meaning is different, and girls need help understanding, navigating that, and claiming gender on the terms that work for them. Another thing about disability that affects what girls with disabilities need from us is that being perceived as failing is often a big part of the lives of people with disabilities, and again, girls in particular, because disability is often first identified as failure to meet milestones. Getting accommodations in schools typically involves like professionals making these long lists of things you're ostensibly failing at. Disability means often finding yourself unable to do a lot of things that others think, oh, everyone can do that, or that's easy, or this is everyone's thing. And it also means dealing with a lot of people who see you as not good enough, either physically or morally. And that's really hard. And if we want to lift up girls with disabilities, we need to get that they're dealing with that too. Sometimes, in some ways, it intersects with everything, and certainly it includes intersections with gender. So we really need to believe in our bones that you can't flunk being a kid, you can't fail at being a kid or a girl. It's okay to be different. Whatever kind of body you have, you're okay as a person. And this is likely to be hard for the girls we're working with. and we need to understand that context and be kind. Another layer of gender and disability for girls is that a lot of disabilities are stereotyped as male, which can lead to a lot of misunderstandings. One example of this is autism. Autism is a real common disability in both boys and girls, but it's often thought of and spoken of as a boy's disability. And even some professionals are under the impression that it's a boy thing, girls don't get it and don't diagnose girls. I know of women who are autistic and who have had that experience, and have had real trouble getting diagnosis and support because people have told them right out, like, women don't get that. Yeah. Girls, and especially feminine girls, are often undiagnosed or diagnosed at a later age. And when girls are diagnosed, the framework for supporting them might be designed around the needs of boys and might not think about necessarily the things that girls might need support with, or things that might sometimes be different for girls. Another thing is that girls who are known to be autistic might be presumed to be more like boys, and to be not really girls, in part because of a pretty baseless theory propounded by a pretty influential person that what autism is an extreme male brain, which doesn't really make sense. Like, I don't know if brains really have gender, but autistic girls are girls, autistic boys are boys. People are the gender they are, and having a brain that is different from the norm doesn't make you any less of a girl. And it's important that we both be aware of that stereotype so that we don't have it ourselves, and so that we understand that other people do and that it affects the lives of girls. Another thing that's important to remember is that girls aren't invisible. I've heard a lot of conversations that say things like, girls are underdiagnosed because girls mask symptoms. Now, I don't think that's really true. I think it's that when we look for boys, we don't notice girls. And it's not necessarily that girls aren't visible or don't show things. It's that if we're only looking for boys, we don't find girls. A couple of ways that can happen. Again, this is huge and complicated. I could spend, days or books talking about this, but I'll give a couple of examples. One thing that happens is that girls who are interested in girl things can get overlooked when people are looking for boys. Because, some girls are interested in stereotypical male things. A lot of girls are interested in stereotypical female things. When autism or something is associated with male-coded interests, girls who are interested in girl stuff might not be noticed. So if what you're looking for is boys fascinated with trains and computers, you may miss noticing the girls who are fascinated by things like cats, ponies, and fairy tales, even if their relationship to the things they're interested in are pretty similar. And again, some girls are interested in stereotypically male things, and girls who are interested in stereotypically male things are more likely to be noticed, because that's often what people less disabled, and we need to make sure we're looking for them and not treating them as invisible. Another thing that can happen is that girls who are quiet are sometimes overlooked. And again, this isn't universal, like all behavior is done by both boys and girls, but there's sort of some trends in what's typical for boys and what's typical for girls. And what will often happen is that boys who are having trouble in school are more likely to be disruptive. Girls who are having trouble in school are more likely to be withdrawn. And if you're looking for loud boys, you may also find the loud girls, but you're likely to miss the quiet girls, because they're not boys and they're not loud. So just keeping in mind that disability doesn't erase gender, and gendered behavior can make the manifestation of disability look different in boys than it does in girls. So we've got to think about both at the same time if we want to understand things. Another thing that will happen, even when boys and girls don't behave differently, is that, this is documented not just for disability, but really for anything, that the same exact behavior and presentation is often interpreted completely differently in boys than it is in girls. For instance, when girls speak up even less than boys, they're often perceived as dominating the conversation. Likewise, even when the same symptoms are noticed and documented, if people are thinking about boys, they might not notice the implications of symptoms, even when the symptoms themselves are noticed, documented, and when they notice and document similar things in boys, it results in a diagnosis. So we've got to be careful about gender stereotyping and disability, and we've got to be careful that we notice girls and that we take the impairments girls have seriously, even when they're not acting like stereotypical boys. Another thing that can happen with girls that's closely related is that sometimes disability is attributed to gender nonconformity, particularly for girls who are not diagnosed, because girls with disabilities are often unable to do some things that are expected of girls. This is sometimes the first sign of impairment that people notice, because when girls are not gender conforming and are not integrated with other girls, that tends to make people worry. And for girls, that might make people worry before there's a sign of academic problems, or before there's a sign of other impairments. So sometimes the gender nonconformity or gender non-inclusion is noticed first, and it can be assumed that that's the problem and that it can be fixed by insisting that she act more like a girl, or teaching her how to be a girl, or to be ladylike or something. But gender conformity is not actually a legitimate treatment for anything. And it's a problem for two reasons. One is it's okay for girls to have a variety of gender presentations, but also because disability that makes it harder to do stuff is not something that can be fixed by trying to get someone to act more feminine. And again, it's important both to be aware of this so that when girls are having trouble integrating with girls, we don't assume that the problem is that they need to act more like girls. But it's also important because we need to understand the likelihood of girls we're supporting having had experience with being treated this way, and that it might complicate how they feel when people talk about being a girl. Another thing that can happen, this again is more likely when girls do have a diagnosis, is that sometimes therapy will treat gender nonconformity as a symptom, especially in girls. If girls have a disability and aren't conforming to gender expectations, again, especially when their diagnosis is something like autism or an intellectual disability, they may be presumed to be acting that way because they lack social understanding. Social understanding may be defined implicitly as gender conformity. It can also be pretty heteronormative and assume that girls want to date boys, stuff like that. So it's real important to not treat someone's chosen gender expression as a symptom or a problem, because girls with disabilities, like all girls and women, figure out what kinds of gender expression is going to be tenable for them through trial and error. And there are always trade-offs, but deciding that we're going to take the trade-off of being less gender conforming and taking some heat for that is a decision that girls with disabilities get to make. So some examples of this. So say an autistic girl or a girl with sensory processing issues finds lacy dresses physically painful. Maybe this is a problem, maybe it isn't. If she wants to be able to wear lacy dresses, that's a problem. If she thinks the best solution is not to wear lacy clothing, that's okay. That's a decision she gets to make. And putting somebody through like coercive, painful therapy to get them to tolerate textures so they can dress like a girl isn't a nice thing to do, and it happens to a lot of people. For instance, another example is like a girl who cuts her hair real short and who people think is a lesbian might be one, or might want to be perceived as one. It's not necessarily a sign of lack of social understanding. Girls also get to decide what they're interested in, and that might be things that are more associated with boys than with girls, and that's okay. Another thing that can happen for girls with disabilities is that sometimes some aspects of gender conformity can be impossible or impractical. For instance, facial differences can sometimes make it impossible to look conventionally pretty in a way that others will find acceptable. And there's social consequences to that. And that's not something that girls with disabilities can make go away. And so it's just important to be aware that this is a thing. Motor skills impairments can limit participation in certain female-coded activities, like say makeup, hairstyling, making friendship bracelets, or whatever other girl social bonding activity depends on motor skills. So instead, if you're running a group for girls, thinking about what the activities are that are shared and important, and how you can make shared important girl activities work for all the girls in your group really matters, because being left out of defining girl stuff can be really hard. Another thing that can happen is that there's a lot of social expectations around how girls' voices sound and what volume women are allowed to speak at, what tones of voice you're allowed to have. And for people with speech disorders, speaking in the way that women are expected to speak is not always possible. And boys have this problem too, but the range of ways women are allowed to talk is a lot narrower. And girls who can't do that can't gain the ability to do that by being told that what they're doing is unladylike. They need to find ways of dealing with that, and we need to be kind. Another thing that can happen is that sometimes people's chosen forms of gender expression require support. And they don't always get it because people don't always think of this as a legitimate thing to spend support efforts on. But some examples here are like girls with impaired motor skills who maybe want long hair or want to wear makeup may need someone to help them make that happen if they don't have the physical ability to do it themselves. Or they may need adaptive equipment or help finding a way of doing it that will work for them. And girls with disabilities who want to spend time with other girls may need help figuring out how to make that work too. There are any number of ways this can play out. And it's important to keep in mind that gender expression isn't frivolous or shallow. And girls who care about that and want help with that, have the right to have help with that and to have respect around that. Because gender expression isn't frivolous, it's not shallow. Gender expression is really important to most people, and being cut off from ways of doing that will send the message you want to send can be really painful. So we need to see it as legitimate, which is somewhat countercultural because things that are associated with women and femininity are often presumed to be frivolous or shallow, but they're not. They're important, and we need to respect and support them. People don't need to be gender conforming, but people do need to be supported in the gender expression that matches how they want to be in the world. Another sort of overarching theme here is that ableism affects the lives of girls from the time that they are identified as different. just like sexism affects the lives of girls from the time that they are identified as girls. So as soon as a disabled girl is visibly different from typically developing peers, she's going to face disability prejudice and discrimination. Whether or not she's identified as disabled yet, whether or not anyone has words for it yet, she's going to face it, and she's going to face just as much prejudice and discrimination in girl things as in things that are gender neutral. And access to girl things matters as much as access to gender neutral things, particularly when what we're talking about is our efforts to uplift and empower girls. So let's talk about some implicit questions that can loom real large for girls with disabilities in our community. One real basic one related to all the stuff we talked about stereotyping is, when people say girls and women, do they mean me? Am I part of that? Being excluded from girl things really hurts because, again, as we said before, most girls, including girls with disabilities, care about being seen as girls. Most girls have an idea of what being a girl or acting like a girl or being with girls means. Most girls feel hurt or humiliated when others see them as not living up to what a girl should be. Most girls especially feel hurt or humiliated when they feel like they're not living up to their image of what a girl should be. And so this question of, does girls and women mean me, can loom really large and be really painful, and we need to be prepared to support people in navigating that. Being excluded from efforts to empower girls really hurts, especially when people care deeply about sexism and then don't include you. So here I have a picture where there's a female rabbi talking about a group of girls. And she's saying it's important to teach girls that they are welcome and that their voices matter. And they're in an inaccessible room you have to go upstairs to get to. And there's a girl in a wheelchair on the outside who can't get in. And at first it bothered me that the image I had for that was one where she's smiling, because this is really painful. But then I realized the smile kind of represents something real, because girls with disabilities are often taught that they're not allowed to be upset about this and that people will be angry if they show that this hurts. And so I think that we need to be proactive about realizing that even if no one's saying anything to us, even if people are smiling, being excluded in these ways really hurts, especially when people can see that we care deeply about addressing injustice except for them. So we've got to be proactive about making sure that we're being accessible, we're being inclusive, and that we say girls, we mean the girls with disabilities too. And to just think about, does what we mean by girl have room for disability? Our programs that we say are for girls, accessible to girls with disabilities, can they participate? Are they valued? Do they know that? Are they invited? Because if we don't invite people, and if we don't make our intentions around access clear, people who have been hurt before will often assume that they're not welcome or that they won't be treated well and stop trying. So we've got to be accessible, and we have to let it be known that we're accessible, and we have to be prepared to change things to make sure that our words are meaningful. Another part of this that matters is stories. When we talk about girls and women, when we talk about empowering girls and women, when we talk about the living as a girl and a woman, it matters that girls are able to see themselves in those stories. So it's worth asking, in the stories you tell about women, are any of the women ever disabled? In the stories you tell about sexism, are any of the girls and women ever disabled? When you talk about empowering girls, do you have real examples of girls with disabilities being part of that? Another element of this for girls, a question related to, you know, does girl mean me, is do I have to choose between gender expression and accessibility? Because since the appearance of someone's accessibility tools can be such a big part of how they're perceived and how they look, it's also often part of their gender expression. And when everything is either gender neutral or male coded, that excludes girls from types of gender expression they may want. It's important that we're careful not to inadvertently limit the range of available gender expression. And there are ways we'll have control over this and ways we won't. But whatever context you're working in, it's probably going to come up. And if you think about it proactively, it's easier to address. So to give an example, a simple example is, say, fidget toys, or as the autistic community calls them, STEM toys, with and without a range of gender options. So you see on the left, there's a picture where all of the fidgets are gender neutral. And then on the right, there's a picture where some of them are pink. And now, not all girls like pink. Girls shouldn't have to use pink things. But when girls don't have the option, that sends a message about who we're thinking about and who we're not. When girls who otherwise would choose pink things, would coded things, can't do that when they're choosing an accessibility tool, that's making them choose between accessibility and gender expression. And it's sending a message that disability is a boy thing. And even for girls who reject pink, having the choice matters, because there's a difference between rejecting something and being excluded from something. To give a couple of other examples, which are not necessarily things that we'll have control over in most of our settings, is that, say, for girls who who aren't able to speak reliably and use communication devices to communicate, being able to decide what color they are can be really important, especially when it's often going to be the first thing someone notices about you. Being able to decide what color you want it to be, what presentation you want, matters. And gender expression and mobility aids is also an important thing for some people. And there's a range of that, right? Some people like pink, some people like red, some people like flames, some people like sparkles. And all people like being able to have how they look represent how they want to look and what messages they want to send. Another field, and another one, this is one we will have more control over often, is that what does symbol supported or visually supported materials look like? So if we're using pictures to help someone understand something, or if we're using, say, a visual schedule where each step in the schedule is represented by an image, for putting images alongside the text to support people who are less literate, if all the pictures are of men, that sends a certain message about who we're thinking about, both in general and who we're thinking about as people who have access needs and are valued in a disability context. So making sure we're thinking about girls and women and the visibility of girls and women and the range of gender expression people might want can be really important. And we can't fix all of it, but we can fix some of it, and being proactive helps. Another question that can loom really large is, does the Jewish people mean me? I often experience this as a Jewish woman, just in general. I hear a lot of Jewish men having all male panels where they talk about the importance of Jewish unity without including any women on the panel or quoting any women. And that's pretty annoying, especially when all the men in the community who are having decision-making power about what Jewish unity means and what to prioritize are all men who aren't listening to women much. It's a really big problem. And a similar thing happens to people with disabilities, and especially people who are both disabled and female, is the Jewish people can be defined in a way that just doesn't seem to notice that you exist and matter sometimes. So we have to think about, when do Jewish girls with disabilities see themselves in stories about being Jewish, or in stories about Israel, or in stories about the work and obligations of being Jewish, or being funding priorities, or being people who are seen as having a Jewish contribution to make? Does the Jewish people mean me? When people say that the Jewish community is important and that we need everyone, does everyone mean me? Sometimes the answer to that ends up seeming like no, and we've got to make sure the answer to that is yes in the spaces we have control over. A very closely related part of this is, does Jewish continuity include me? Excuse me. So we talk a lot about Jewish continuity in a lot of settings, especially in programs for teenagers, especially in programs for young adults. And Jewish continuity often means you need to marry and make Jewish kids. And that's what the Jewish future is, especially for girls. And so are we seeing girls with disabilities as part of the Jewish future, and are we enabling them to see themselves as part of the Jewish future? This is a hard one, and there's a lot of tshuva repair work that we need to do here. So Jewish continuity, and again, this is problematic in a number of directions, but what the implied expectation of supporting Jewish continuity often means for typically developing girls is that, you're part of the Jewish future, is that you're going to be an adult, and then you're going to use your body to physically contribute to Jewish continuity by making Jewish kids. This can be pretty intense pressure. It can get beyond the idea that having kids is a Jewish value to the idea that, I think most Jewish women have encountered people with power who believe that every child we don't have is a victory for Hitler. Every year that passes before we start having kids is an attack on Jewish continuity, or that we're doing something wrong if we ever prioritize anything else. And that's really hard to be on the receiving end of. And it can be hard in a different way for girls with disabilities, because while girls with disabilities encounter the idea that this is what it means to be an adult Jewish woman, they also encounter the assumption that they will never marry and that they should not have children and that people like them should not be part of physical Jewish continuity. And it's real hard to be on the receiving end of both of those messages at once, as girls with disabilities often are. So, because they get this combination sometimes of both women must and you shouldn't. So where does that leave them? Either sentiment's hard to cope with. It's really hard to deal with both at once. And it's real easy to send mixed messages like this without realizing that we're doing that. One example here is the way we talk about genetic testing sends a message, and often the message is not one that makes women with disabilities feel valued. So we often talk about Jewish genetic testing is often described as being, so we need to prevent the birth of children with these awful genetic conditions. And some of the things on those panels are conditions that are not survivable, but some of those conditions are things where people usually do live to adulthood. And I know people who have genetic conditions that are on that screening panel, and they have feelings about that. And we need to, when we talk about genetic testing, it's important to speak with the assumption that people who have those genetic conditions are in the room and that what we say will affect them. Which is not to say that I'm opposed to genetic testing. All I'm saying is that I think that we need to be careful how we talk about it and what messages that sends about how people are valued. Another layer on how problematic this is that sometimes the only time we talk about disability in reproduction or disability in parenting is in the context of advocating for genetic testing. And so that really sends a message. If kids hear things that are about preventing more people like them from being born, and they don't hear things about people like them being parents, and they're getting the message that the way to be an adult Jewish woman is to be a mother, that puts them in a really untenable position. And we need to think about that when we talk about all of this. Related to this, girls with disabilities really need to see adult women with disabilities, because it's much easier to see yourself as having a future when you see adults who you can imagine growing up to be like, and having adults in your community who you can grow up to be like. So being able to see women with disabilities, Jewish women with disabilities, mothers with disabilities, really makes things more tenable for girls with disabilities. They're still hard, but they're possible. Another question that can loom real large is, am I going to be safe here, and do I have the right to be safe? One layer on this is, if I say something is unsafe, are people going to believe me? And yeah, this happens a lot. A lot of activities that are great for typically developing people are impossible or unsafe for people with disabilities, which means that often being inclusive means changing the activity. It can mean changing something that people really like, the way it's always been done. And when you've never thought of the possibility that something is unsafe, and a girl with a disability says, this is unsafe for me, I need to do it differently, a lot of times she's not going to be believed, both because women aren't believed, girls aren't believed, and people with disabilities aren't believed, and people who are both or double not believed. So just think about, how are you going to make sure that you respond appropriately when girls with disabilities think something is unsafe for them, and where you create an environment where it's possible for them to speak up about things being unsafe without fearing retaliation. Another aspect of this is the issue of Me Too and sexual violence, and how those conversations can be more complicated for girls with disabilities on two levels. Girls with disabilities experience sexual violence at significantly higher rates than typically developing girls, but it can be different. For instance, girls with disabilities may not be perceived as girls in public spaces, which may mean that they don't get catcalled or that they don't get the same kind of sexual harassment. So when the conversation about consent, gender-based violence, and sexual violence focuses on that, and we say, this happens to all girls and women, it can really end up sending the message to girls with disabilities that we don't care about the things that happen to them, or that we don't see them as real girls, especially in combination with all of the other messages they get that kind of tell them, we don't see you as a real girl. So I think that we've got to talk about sexual violence and consent, and we need to make sure that we're being inclusive and making room for the range of disabilities the range of experiences that girls have. Another way that the conversation about consent and sexual violence is that gender dynamics are sometimes different for girls with disabilities in terms of who has the power to violate their physical boundaries. Because therapy for kids is often very physically and emotionally invasive. And most of the therapists and paraprofessionals who work with kids are women. So if you're talking about the experience of having somebody feel like they're entitled to touch your body in private places in ways you don't like, a lot of times the most intense experiences girls will have had with that is with female therapists. Either just because it was unavoidable or sometimes because the therapist was abusive. I know both of those things happen. And so when girls who have like experienced these things as really intimate, physical, painful violations, and then they're in this empowerment group for girls that talks about violence and consent solely or primarily in terms of male entitlement to women's bodies, it can feel really alienating. It can make it feel like there's no room to talk about their actual experiences. And it's just important to be aware of the fact that these gender dynamics and the associations of gender power and violation can be different for girls who have grown up with disabilities and who have grown up with their boundaries disregarded in other ways. Another layer on this question that girls may not quite be ready to ask yet, but that eventually becomes really important is, how can it be okay that disability is part of who I am? So your bodies matter, brains matter. And just like I am defined in some ways by being a woman, I'm defined in some ways by old. And having that as a positive part of self-image makes it possible to have self-respect and be okay with yourself all the time. If you're only okay with yourself when you're ignoring gender or when you're ignoring disability, it becomes really difficult to be comfortable in your own skin when you face discrimination or you need medical treatment or you want to get pregnant or something else like that, where gender becomes suddenly unignorable. So having all of yourself be something that you can see as part of yourself without it hurting too much matters a lot, and it's part of positive identity formation and part of positive Jewish identity formation. And so just like figuring out how to deal with being a woman is sort of part of what girls do. Figuring out how to make life work as a disabled girl and woman is something that girls with disabilities do. Navigating gender is more complicated because disabled girls face the same gender pressures, but also significant barriers to doing the things that are expected of girls and women, and also may kind of not be seen as having a real gender. So sometimes gender expression and all of that is something that you have to end up having to fight for. The quote from a colleague, Rabbi Julia Watts-Balzer, about this in her article "God on Wheels: Disability and Jewish Feminist Theology," which I would highly recommend reading the whole thing. It's awesome. Anyway, she says, growing up disabled, growing up queer, the stakes were stark. It's either kindle tenacious love for myself or swallow the world's projections whole. As a feminist, as a queer woman, and as a disabled bisexual Jew, I insist on honoring the integrity of a self that has often been disdained. That's just like crucial to being okay as a person when you have any or all of these attributes. So how do we help girls get there? One way is to show them positive images of girls and women with disabilities, and to just do this sort of as a matter of course in like for all girls, not just the ones who have disabilities, but just make positive images of disability part of our culture. So if you're working with younger kids or older kids who aren't worried, who are kids who are old enough that they won't worry about you thinking they're little, Sesame Street has some great stuff. Sesame Street and autism, yeah, it's all online. So they have a female autistic Muppet who very unusually in these kinds of efforts, they developed with input from like adult autistic women leaders who really know what they're about. And there are videos, picture books, and activities featuring her, and there are other videos and things. And making characters and stories like that part of the conversation is really helpful to positive identity formation. Another thing is seeing like women's disability advocacy specifically. So this is the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. And here's, you know, one of their logos says autism is not a boys club. And just encountering that sentiment helps. Learning disabled womanhood from disabled women helps girls, because girls with disabilities need to know they can grow up to be real women, which is easier when they see people like them. Part of this too is that there's more to disability than facing discrimination. I'm going to go back to Rabbi Watzwaltzer's article again. I fear that by conceptualizing disability primarily as an access problem to be solved, we fail to invite in the vibrant, transgressive possibility of disability culture, of a crip sensibility that celebrates disability as a way of life, as a radically different way of moving through the world. Again, read the whole article, it's awesome, but this is positive Jewish women's identity that incorporates disability. And another example of this, Julia Vascom is not Jewish, but this is relevant anyway. On autistic experience with obsessions, it's not anything recognized on the continuum of normal. So the experience is so rich, it's textured, vibrant, and layered. It exudes joy. It is a hug machine for my brain. It makes my heart pump faster and my mouth twitch back into a smile every few minutes. I feel like I'm sparkling. Every inch of me is totally engaged and empowered up by the obsession. Things are clear. It is beautiful. It is perfect. And I'm not going to read the whole Laura Hershey quote here. One thing she says that really resonates with me and that I try to keep in mind all the time is we have something the world needs. And helping girls with disabilities to have the sense that you have something the world needs as the whole person you are, and you have something that the Jewish community and the Jewish future needs as the person you really are, can be transformative. Related to this, a question that looms real large is, does my voice matter? Are we treating girls with disabilities as having an important perspective? Because the best way to see yourself as having a positive Jewish identity is to have experiences being valued in Jewish community and the Jewish conversation. So some questions to ask. During class or group discussions, are girls with disabilities called on and taken seriously? When she asks questions related to disability, does she get an answer? When being a girl or having a disability is relevant to what she thinks or feels about the topic at hand, is she allowed to say so? Are the teacher and other students expected to engage with the points she makes, including when she mentions disability or gender in ways that might be jarring? Give some examples. What response would this question get? Teacher says, all Israelis go to the army. And this girl who's a wheelchair user says, what would I do in the army? Yeah. Is there an awkward pause in a subject change? Or do people engage with the question? What about this question? It's important to get genetic testing to protect your family's future. And then the same girl says, do you think I shouldn't have been born? Does that get an angry response? Does that get an awkward pause in a subject change? Or does the question get engaged with? And how, and is it appropriate, and how does she feel afterwards? Or this one, all girls are encouraged to go on the girls' empowerment camping trip. And so she asks, will there be an accessible bathroom? Does that get answered, engaged with, and treated as important? And all of this is big. All of this is easier said than done. And I have more questions than answers here, but some questions I'd like us to keep asking are, when we talk about Jewish identity, how are we including girls with disabilities? When we talk about disability inclusion, do we remember that some people with disabilities are female? When we talk about the Jewish future, how are we teaching that girls and women with disabilities are part of it? When we talk about empowering girls, how are we including girls with disabilities in that? And what's our Jewish spiritual response to how their lives are? And as usual, this is huge, easier said than done. Being Jewish about it helps, because we know it is not upon us to complete the work, but neither are we free to desist from it. We all have something to add that matters, and none of us can do all of it, but we can all do parts of it. So it's 2:00, and this is the end of these slides. If people want to stay around for questions, I will stay for a few more minutes, and I'm watching the chat. So would anyone like to ask any questions or have any comments? Okay. And we'll stop now. Thank you everyone for coming, and for standing up for girls and being in solidarity for girls. And if you have any questions or comments, I can be reached at rabbi@matankids.org. Thank you again, and let's go forward and lift up girls.